I want to begin by just expressing appreciation, deep appreciation to our choir, our accompanist, to Elizabeth for what a beautiful piece of music and a mighty choir. That was gorgeous. Thank you so very, very much. Many of you probably recognize some passages from the book of Isaiah that we often recall during the Advent and Christmas season. There's some texts there in Isaiah that we love from Handel's Messiah. There's these beautiful images of the lion and the lamb lying together in peace. As it happens, Isaiah was really written in 3 sections, at least that's what we learned in seminary, and it's really 3 different books, not necessarily or almost surely not written by one particular author, but by several authors over time. This passage that Irvin just read for us from Isaiah 65 is from the very last section of Isaiah, kind of the concluding comments, if you will, the epilogue. Isaiah begins during the time when the children of Israel are enjoying the good life in Jerusalem, in Judah, and the first section of Isaiah is calling their attention to the ways that they have forgotten God and forgotten God's ways and begun to oppress the poor and the needy and turned away from God. And Isaiah is trying to wake them up and call their attention to all the injustice in their land and saying that a great power from the east will come and will conquer them and carry away their descendants into exile. When I think about Isaiah and learning about that in seminary almost 40 years ago now, I know back in the 1980s was kind of the end of the Cold War, and suddenly it seemed like the world might be a somewhat safer place. And it's hard for me to come to grips, really, with the fact that Isaiah, written over 2,500 years ago, still describes our world today, when a superpower from the east overruns a foreign land and takes captives back home with them. It's still happening today, isn't it? Second Isaiah, the middle section of Isaiah, is really about life in exile. After the superpower from the east, Babylon, has conquered Judah and Jerusalem, has kind of destroyed their beautiful city, Jerusalem, has carried many of the brightest and best off into exile, and they have to reconcile themselves with the fact that they are no longer living the good life, that they are now slaves in a foreign land, and how God is yet with them in their exile, in their pain and suffering. And you may remember the psalm, "How can we sing a song to Zion when we are weeping beside the river of Babylon?" That's the middle section of Isaiah. And now this third section of Isaiah is a call to great hope that God will restore your fortunes. Several generations have lived their lives, been born and died in exile, and now third Isaiah, picking up on the tradition, says that God will accompany you back to Jerusalem once again, where you will rebuild the beautiful city of Jerusalem. And then we have these wonderful images here about how the land will be so fruitful that it will be full of peace, there will be abundance and bounty, and thinking about coming up to Thanksgiving soon, that you will give thanks for God's goodness. Now thank we all our God for bringing them back into Jerusalem and the rebuilding of their beautiful city. And the verses that really stood out for me, that really struck me, were these middle verses, and they were part of that cover image on the bulletin today from Isaiah 65, verse 21. They, meaning the children of Israel that had for generations lived in exile in Babylon and been the slaves of their Babylonian conquerors, now they as they return to Jerusalem, they will build houses and inhabit them. They won't build houses for others, they'll build their own house. They will plant vineyards and eat their own fruit. They won't just be migrant farm workers raising food for others. They will actually eat their own fruit of their hands. And again, it says it in the negative, they shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. But again, this vision of hope, like the days of the trees shall be the days of my people. My chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. So it's the hope of a transformed society in which those who do the work are able to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Now, once again, this was written over 2,500 years ago, and yet it seems so practical, so realistic today. How many of us, over the last 2.5 years, whether we're living in our own places or maybe living in some form of retirement community, how many of us have relied on other essential workers to keep us safe, to help us be fed, to grow the food and process it and transport it and deliver it to our doors? How many of you used, some form of food delivery service or grocery delivery service during the pandemic? How much time do we spend thinking about the lives of those who currently serve us, who keep us housed and our homes well maintained, those service providers, those essential workers? And we know that the burden of the pandemic fell most heavily upon them for a variety of reasons, in part because they were essential and they were the ones who were keeping us safe and well in our own places. So we didn't have to go out and be exposed to all those bad germs, right? So my question for us today is what would it look like if we as a community of faith, if we were committed to this vision from God? This vision that says those who do the work get to enjoy the fruits of their labor. There's a concept that is kind of gaining some traction, as far as I know, here in our greater Portland metro area, the concept of workforce housing. Has anyone ever heard that term before? Workforce housing? What do you suppose that's about? I know across the river, we live in West Lynn near the campus of the former Marylhurst University. Right beside it is Mary's Woods Continuing Care Retirement Community. I know also Barbara lives at Willamette View, and next door there's Rose Villa. I know when my mother was living at Willamette View, she relied tremendously on all those essential workers who took care of her so she didn't have to go out and interact in the world. The maintenance people, the food service people, on and on and on and on. I know, too, that my mother, when she was alive, made a special point of cultivating relationships with the workers who took care of them, and especially the young women, sometimes teenagers, who came to work in the dining room. She was in the assisted living part of Willamette View. Their dining room was probably smaller than the space here of our sanctuary. I think there's roughly 30 to 40 residents in the assisted living in Willamette View. And you could probably imagine, if you're eating 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, you get to know not only your neighbors, but you get to know those other folks who were there serving you. Not so much the people in the back of the house in the kitchen, but certainly those young people that are serving you, right? And my mother made a very special point of getting to know them and interacting with them. And as like many of you, as a retired teacher, she would always strike up conversations with them about their life aspirations and their goals and what they were doing. And many of them at that age of 18, 19, 20, were making their way in the world. This might be their first kind of full-time, or at least many hours of pay, and they were kind of finding the benefits of being a working person, no longer necessarily going to school. And oftentimes my mother would be encouraging them, but you need to continue your education, because that's the way you can grow into the fullness of life. And it was interesting, thinking back about my family story. It was not that long ago, it was really only one generation ago, that my parents were part of that group of essential workforce who were growing the food for the nation. And probably many of us as well, whether we ourselves, it might have been our parents or grandparents, who were also part of the essential workforce of this nation, right? And so it doesn't take too much imagination to think, what would it be like to be a part of that essential workforce? And what would it be like if you were working for the benefit of others and had enough just to eke out a mere existence, just enough to get by? I know we had a meeting here last month in which someone who's involved now in our Greater Portland Metro Land and Housing Coalition, who talked about the fact that she grew up with a family of migrant farm workers. That was her family. And then as an adult, she went into education and became involved in educating particularly the children of migrant farm workers. But again, what would it look like if we, St. Paul's, were committed to supporting the efforts of creating homes for those who are the essential workers who keep us safe and well-fed and alive? What could that look like? Well, one of the ways that could look like is working with other congregations in our area that are also working on this same issue. So, for example, King of Kings Lutheran Church on the other side of the 224 Expressway, Pastor Josh Kingsley, who many of you know, they've been talking about some community developers and housing developers who've told them, well, you see, the land that you have, which is not flat like St. Paul's, it's kind of hilly. You might have enough space here, beyond your existing buildings and parking lot to build about 30 housing units on your property. And the possibility could be that those would be workforce housing. But the developer explained to the church leaders there that 30 isn't really enough to make it worthwhile for a developer to invest all the time and energy and the funds to create that kind of affordable housing. But if you were collaborating, if you were partnering with some other community organizations or congregations that also had buildable land, we can do what's called a scattered development, which means that we can kind of build at the same time with all the same materials and the same workforce, but we can have it on multiple sites that are nearby to each other. And so suddenly there's all kinds of new opportunities that are opened up when we think about all the congregations that we're working with, when we think about not only King of Kings Lutheran Church, but also Milwaukee Lutheran Church and Oak Grove United Methodist Church and St. Paul's United Methodist Church and others, Milwaukee UCC on Webster. Now suddenly you could have a large multi-site development, and one of the goals could be to house the very people or people just like the people who help to build that structure and help to grow the food and provide the other services that are essential services for folks just like us. So I think for me at least, it's exciting to think about the possibilities of living into God's vision for God's people that is well over 2,000 years old, well before Jesus was born. That we too are called into this vision of being a part of God's chosen people and being a part of a movement where those who build and maintain the houses can afford to live in them. We're those who grow the food and transport it and deliver it to us that they can afford to eat that same food. What a vision that would be. So let's be thinking, let's be open, let's have our hearts and minds and spirits open to the ways that God may be calling us to engage in a work far beyond our limited scope or limited imagination of just St. Paul's United Methodist Church on our own, but thinking about the much larger universe of possibilities as we collaborate with other congregations. Thanks be to God. Amen.